Hello, so this is a discussion today to build upon the themes that came out from the open letter that was co-written by activists and scholars Vlad Bunea and Félix Garnier, calling for a more democratic degrowth movement that provides space for working class, global south and other underrepresented voices to be heard on equal terms, alongside more privileged voices. It was initially read at the 10th International Degrowth Conference in Pontevedra in Spain, and it was later opened for signatures by people who broadly agreed with its messaging. And it wasn't written by the authors as an endpoint, as a list of propositions that are to be adhered to as if there was some sort of doctrine, but very much as a starting point for people to think more broadly and much more critically about where the movement's missing the mark, and ways that people can go about in order to rectify these issues. Félix is currently missing, so we have Vlad, but great for you to be here. He might be on at some point. But we've also invited John Barry, Professor of Green Political Economy at Queen's University Belfast, to join us, to provide a perspective on this letter and its related issues as someone from the professional class, specifically as a white male academic from the global north, a demographic that in everyday society often ends up dominating discussions at the cost of hearing from more diverse voices. So Vlad, if you wanted to kick us off, sort of what prompted you to write the letter?
Thank you, Emma. Good to be here. So on the theoretical side, and I'll try to be as concise as I can, I was grounding the arguments on three ideas: determinism, libertarianism, and inequalities. I won't spend too much time about each one. On the determinist side, reading Sapolsky and other authors, I realized that the conversations is still very much anchored in the meritocracy camp. There's no recognition from science that there's no free will on the individual level, and there's also confusion between personal freedoms and social agency, and that reflects also in the degrowth movement and in the left in general. Number two, libertarianism is the agenda put forward by Ingrid Robbins and other authors. Talks about the moral grounds of having limits to wealth and inequalities. They reference determinism a little bit, but not too much for my taste. And I think my position is a bit stronger on that sense, because I read science, and what Sapolsky says and others is very convincing. And I think we can learn many lessons from that. And number three, inequalities. We all know the numbers, Piketty and all the others. We fight against inequality, but they also do exist within the movements. It's not just about material inequalities, wealth, income, lifestyles, footprints, all of that. It's how we respond to them via status, influence, and power. You know, I have a broader definition of the working class, that it's not just about a stratification based on income and wealth, but it's also about power relations and who has power within their in-group and out-groups. So those three theoretical concepts prompted the letter. And on the practice side, since I was the founder of the Degrowth Collective and a co-founder of the International Degrowth Network, I've had about 2 years practice in grassroots formation here in Toronto, trying to form a group of real people and have meetings in person, and trying to think what we can do using degrowth in real life. And we've had many struggles. We learned some lessons. We had conflicts, internal and external, with factors. There are many lessons to learn from that. One of the barricades that we had to climb was just our position in society. Having to make ends meet as an activist is very difficult. I was working class myself at that time, so I had the full-time job to live, and on my personal time, I had to do all that kind of work, and it's very taxing. And I do a lot of reading. I can say I read as much as any academic out there, and I can write academic papers, but I don't want to. I don't enjoy the format very much, and most degrowth books suffer from that. I wouldn't say incomprehensibility, but accessibility. So I would do away with inline quotations when you want to talk to the general public. Most academic papers are still very jargony and, inaccessible for the general public. And if you skim through the the meat of those papers, there not many have strong content. So those are my positions, my motivations for writing that. Perhaps in the conversation we can build up to the proposals themselves.
So I guess sort of question for both of you, where you mentioned sort of there's a lack of accessibility for papers where it's very heavy in jargon. So what alternative ways of communication sort of can sort of academics and more privileged speakers sort of get out there to people, not just in terms of not needing to know all the jargon to make sense of it, but also if you don't have the money to buy expensive books?
Well, maybe I could jump in, and thanks for the invitation, Emma. Nice to virtually meet you, Vlad. I mean, I do think I would make a case that we do need complex and difficult ways of discussing complex issues. And so there is a role for very specialist discussions, but that should not be the only way in which academics are producing knowledge, or in fact co-producing knowledge. Yes, we can discuss whether or not academics, are we members of the professional managerial class? Are we privileged knowledge workers? Are we middle class in terms of status and income? But maybe some of us have come from working class backgrounds like me. Are we a conflicted class composition? We can talk about that. But I would certainly say, and partly for my own practice, I've been an academic for over 35 years. And it certainly has always been part of my practice to, yes, produce in peer-reviewed journals, although I do less of that now, partly because I don't need it. I don't really see the point of it. And actually, because they're behind paywalls and so on, for the point you were making, Emma, they're inaccessible. But the real skill, I think, of a good academic or researcher or writer is to take a complex issue and be able to make it accessible to a lay readership. And certainly that has, in the course of my academic career, that's become more important even in the training of academics. That does not mean to say, colleagues, that all academics value this, or in fact, they're very good at it. But there has been a move, certainly, that it's not enough for us to produce, good, teaching and peer-reviewed research. It also is about demonstrating impact. The problem I've had, and I work in the United Kingdom context, is higher education is more comfortable with dealing with businesses and policymakers, and less so with the community. But I do think it's not that difficult to provide a jargon-free, simple explanation of what it is you're trying to communicate. I mean, and certainly I've seen some really good examples. They are a minority, but colleagues are able to use infographics, graphic magazines, visual ways in which to communicate what it is that we're trying to do. And I'll just finish by giving people an example for those listening to see, in my view, a really good example of how you can communicate complex ideas about politics, the state of the world, the climate crisis, but in a way that I think is accessible to most citizens. Is that the Royal Society of Arts, the RSA in the UK, if you go onto YouTube and just search for RSA animates, these are really short, usually 7 to 10 minute visual representations. So I think it is about trying to be a lot more creative in terms of how we communicate to ordinary citizens. We're getting there, but we are way short of it. And it partly is the problem, as I see it, and I don't like the term, as you know, Em, I don't like the term degrowth. I think it's too negative, particularly for those that you're trying to appeal to from a working class perspective, who need more. I mean, I know when you dig into it, degrowth is about a different type of abundance. But, as a recovering politician, I certainly know that when you're explaining, you're losing. So I think the term itself is not helpful. And then if you add into that most of those who are promoting degrowth are people like me, white male academics in a privileged position. And I know that there is, arguments for, feminism and the global south, and it is about, equality. But I do think that a lot more work needs to be done to raise up those voices, as both of you have said, from outside the academy and outside this privileged white male. I'm not saying that people are savior complexes. I don't know them personally, but it's a bad look, I think, with the same few voices that you're hearing all the time on the internet or on Twitter or in a newspaper, and it does come across as if there's a couple of leaders here that are going to save us, which I don't think is very helpful.
Is there anything you wanted to add on to that?
Nothing of substance. I think I fully agree with John on this. Perhaps just a quick point of clarification. I do appreciate good academic writing that has substance. So I'm not against it. And there's good value in many papers. And I read literature reviews a lot myself, and I enjoy them, and they're helpful. I do lists myself. So there's strong value in that kind of approach. My position is how to translate that not just into a policy design, but also into popular support and implementation. And that's where the gaps are from my experience. Having a good background of policy research is very important, but that won't get policy done. This proposal builds up to a larger strategy, which talks about citizen assemblies, self-formed, so we don't wait on government to organize them for us. So we do them, make them permanent, have conversations with the working class, with the broader spectrum of society about what policies should be made from those papers and from the conferences. Because in the end, it's people who will vote for those. I've experienced myself with the word degrowth and conversations about how to use it or how not to use it with the working class here in Canada. And if we talk policy, they're very responsive. And I talked degrowth policies with people without using the word degrowth, such as maximum wealth. I asked people, what do you think about 10 million cap on wealth? 100% agreement for that, or housing as a human right, or a free public transit, fully very accessible nationwide. There's enormous support for that. So I think having a conversation around policy will be very much conducive to towards progress.
I agree. I'll just add one quick point. It's partly to do with certainly my experience of what I would call the political economy of academia over the past 3 decades. It's what I call, it's not particularly novel, academic capitalism. We've had this proliferation of journals and work and this pressure, certainly in the UK and Irish context, where academics, it's almost like a production treadmill, where for promotion, for tenure, you've got to produce academic articles. And this is where I seriously doubt the quality of a lot of the work that's being produced, because people are producing it because they've been told and incentivized to produce it, not necessarily that they've got something to say. I mean, some of the great academics in the past, I mean, they may have written maybe 1 or 2 books in their entire career and maybe 3 or 4 academic articles, and that was sufficient. Whereas now, unless you're producing 3 articles a year and a book maybe every 3 or 4 years, you're looked at skeptically. And that increase in quantity speaks to your point, Vlad, about the decline in quality.
Coming back to the idea of academic capitalism, that is sort of a good point. It's the publish or perish sort of environment. But even then, what we find is that with citations, and not just sort of degrowth scholarship, but most really in the global north in general, is that you have this dominance of citations and acknowledgement of white English-speaking workers. And I know academics from the global south consistently get sidelined just on the basis that they don't speak English. And I mean, if you have like any sort of ideas as to how that can be overcome, because that in itself is a significant barrier.
I mean, it is a major flaw. It's the linguistic imperialism of English, the language we're speaking. And that is a problem in that it excludes those who are not writing in English. This is interesting, even in the European context, that a lot of French and German scholarship doesn't circulate as easily in the Anglosphere because it's never translated. So it's not just a global South exclusion. Actually, this, linguistic imperialism of English actually excludes or reduces the necessary, fermenting and sharing of ideas. I mean, if the academy and research is anything, it's about, the free flow of information, of debate and discussion. And when it's all being done largely through one language, that is a major problem. It's part of the reason why I myself am relearning my own indigenous language, Irish, which of course, we were colonized as well. We're speaking a language that, is not native to this place, but it's given me advantages in being able to speak in the language of the oppressor or, and so on. So I do think there's something around, I don't know what the answer to that is. Is it that we need people, to be able to speak multiple languages, like perhaps Vlad does, and I'm learning at least English and Irish, to speak a bit of French? Is that the way? Do we have a form of academic Esperanto? I mean, there was a movement, to develop a shared language that everybody could speak. It's the reasons why things like mathematical and science-based subjects don't suffer from this as much, because they're speaking a universal language of maths in a way that we're not when we're speaking a particular language. I think at the very least, we need to lower the barriers of entry for scholars who are not speaking English or don't have access to privileged journals. How do we include those? I mean, one way in which we've done, which is a kind of a liberal response, and it's a bit milk and water, but it's a start, is to decolonize the curriculum, so that at least when we're teaching or writing, we are explicitly trying to not screen out the dead white men, but to really see, well, hold on a minute, how many dead white men do you need in a paper or an academic module to be able to teach it? What about, seeing where are the scholars from, South America, from Asia, from Africa? So I think there's an active demand, or a demand for those scholars like myself in the global north to be actively seeking out those scholars in the global south. And there's a richness there. It's not as if this is new. I mean, some of the best critiques of imperialism have come from Africa in the 1950s and 1960s. And yet, even if you're doing a course on Marxism today in a university, you'd very rarely get Nkrumah mentioned in, or Lubumba and so on.
Yes.
African leaders and so on. So it's an issue about, going back and looking historically at these fantastic, C.L.R. James. There's a whole rich seam of radical thought outside the Anglosphere, which I do think we need to recuperate and reintegrate as part of this, maybe moving beyond decolonization to anti-colonization, almost, you could say.
I'm going to try a practical answer for this, Emma, if I can. Again, I'll try to be brief. I'm alluding to this. We are alluding in the letter to proposals to have, like John said, a proactive approach to this. The global north, from our position of privilege, by being proactive, meaning we go out and seek those authors in the majority world. We invite them. We pay for translation if necessary, or publish them in original in an open source common platform where everyone participates with the original text and an English translation. There's a lot of AI tools, or not even AI, that do a pretty decent translation, so shouldn't be too heavy on cost. So having like a common virtual and real life agora for conversation, I think it would be just the first step towards this inclusion. And of course, again, we allude to egalitarianism in the letter. The attitudes will have to reflect that as well. So it is a behavioral change, dividing equal time between listening and speaking. With the majority world. Not everyone is skilled at learning languages. I'm like in the middle, but I'm doing my best. So if we cannot all learn Swahili or any other language, we use the talents of those who can speak both languages. By that, I mean we pay translators. We invite them to conferences. If we're still going to do degrowth conferences in Europe, international ones, we should do some, put some effort to have them present there, either in person or virtually. And there are other thoughts as well. There are open source platforms being developed right now, like NOS, so that can be studied or Matrix as a common platform with multiple languages. So it doesn't have to be one language.
I think that's a really good idea, and it touches on a really important thing where you mentioned paying translators for their time. I get this a lot. I'm asked to do a hell of a lot of free work by people that I don't know, and I'm always happy to help where I can. But often it's people with the most resources who are, expecting me to do the free work because, we've got this great opportunity. Why don't you just sit down for an hour with us? And it was like, well, you're the 10th person that's asked me this week, so why don't you pay me? So I think that is really progressive. And I think in terms of like the Solidarity Fund and how it's going to support people, it's a voluntary fund. And what you and Félix have mentioned is that people who have the means to could contribute 1% of pre-tax income. So it's up to 50,000 or equivalent. And then 3% from what exceeds 50,000 up to $100,000. and over 100,000 all of the money. And you guys point out that considering that, the movement really does support sort of limits on how much people earn, really they shouldn't have a problem with it. And what kind of, have you had any response from people about the Solidarity Funds?
There's a conversation happening right now about starting this fund with folks at the International Degrowth Network. We are going to have a discussion at the end of August about the details. There are some considerations as where that fund should be placed, under whose governance, what kind of legal format. There are some thoughts about having inside IDN or outside IDN. There's advantages and disadvantages to both approaches, but my position is, for full transparency, there should be some sort of heavy emphasis on both egalitarianism and sortition. So rotation of roles should have a random component to mimic the construction of citizen assemblies, as to avoid frustration and concentration of power and influence. There should also be some sort of independence between the fund that collects the money and the organizations that receive the funds. The idea of having the fund as one entity that collects money and distributes it according to inclusion, sortition, and full transparency. It's very important, this separation. This emphasis on limitarianism with 100% over 100,000. Of course, the number is arbitrary, but it is about limitarianism in the end, and putting your money where you're preaching, so to speak. And my secret desire, and I'll say it publicly, is I would like to be a fly on the wall in the minds of the folks who read the paper and decided not to sign it, especially folks in the global north in solid positions, not necessarily academia, but PMCs, coordinating class, making 100K, 200K a year, and deciding to fight their own cognitive dissonance with all sorts of internal arguments, which we'll never hear. We just see their signature missing from the list of signatures. And I just opened the door for the future. This fund would be a part in a wider network of funds. There's a thinking around that. So we are trying to project in the future as well. But small steps, but not slow, not too slow. And I'd like to welcome my comrade Félix.
Hi, welcome everyone. Sorry, I got my time zones all mixed up. But
No worries.
Here I am. Nice to meet you all. I think, John, I never met you in person. Emma, I'm not sure.
But I may owe you money, so bear that in mind. In fact, I do owe you money, according to Vlad, just to pick up on that point. I think you're absolutely correct in terms of this Solidarity Fund as a kind of bona fide in terms of not just talking, but actually doing something practical. I absolutely agree with you, Emma. There's far too much unpaid labor that is done in movements and not sufficiently recognized. That's not to say money is the only way of recognizing the value of something. None of us is saying that, but the reality is, if you're in a secure academic position like me, that's very different than if you're a PhD student like you, Emma, or you've got a number of precariously short-term jobs, perhaps like you, Vlad. I don't know your situation. So I think it's a modest step in the right direction. Ideally, I've often thought of the amount of money academics we produce for publishers, for example. We produce this knowledge, they then monetize it behind a paywall, and very little of it often comes back to the academy. Now, there are some smarter, and here's a model perhaps to build upon what you were talking about, Vlad. There are some professional academic associations who are able to control the journal themselves, and they have a lot more power over the publisher, whereby the money that's made by the journal, if any, they either say, well, we're going to allow open access for our work, or any money that they gain, they then distribute back to postgraduate opportunities, conferences, and so on. So I think all of these ideas need to be on the table. What I like about the Solidarity Fund that you both wrote about in your letter is that it's eminently part of a working class resistance. The cooperative movements and even the healthcare schemes of many workers in the 19th century, they began by workers clubbing their money together to help whenever one of their work colleagues fell ill. There was a way of helping them out. And so, that's outside the state system. That comes along later. So I think something like that, why would you be against giving a modest part of your income. So like you, Vlad, I'd be extremely interested, to say the least, to have a conversation with colleagues who are probably earning even more than me in a secure job. Why wouldn't you give a small portion of your income to such a solidarity fund? Because it does seem to me to be a performative contradiction that you write about these things, and yet when it comes to you doing something very modest, we're not asking people to go on the front line of a Just Stop Oil protest or even go on strike. I mean, that's another more activist orientation I'd like to see more academics get involved in. And it is for them to justify, why would they not, offer a modest portion of their income to help others who are in a less economically secure position, to enable them to be more autonomous. But also, and I think it's the point your letter also makes, let's finish on this, there's a sense of us all in this together. We're all colleagues together. Some of us are in institutions with privilege and economic security and access to resources that others aren't. But we are all in this together. And what better way of demonstrating that than us sharing the resources that we have as best we can?
Thank you, John, for all that.
I think that's what you said about we're all in it together is really important, because from the letter and from speaking to people about the letter, I get the feeling that people don't feel that we are. So there were some people that didn't sign it because they didn't agree with everything, which is fine. We had some issues with people as to how to sign it, because Google Forms can be a bit of a nightmare. But then there were people who didn't feel that they could put their name to it because they felt, well, I don't want to be seen to be sort of too critical about the degrowth movement. I don't want it to be seen as a personal attack and sort of the ramifications that could have on me, which is a shame, because I know for both of you, it wasn't written in that way. I think sort of going forward, I think there needs to be a much greater awareness that we need to be a lot more self-critical about all of us.
No, I think that's a really important point, and often for me, the mark of maybe the immaturity of a movement or initiative where we can't have these open conversations. Good friends and colleagues and comrades should be able to respectfully hold each other accountable for our actions or inactions. And for me, maybe, and this could be very controversial, it maybe denotes a kind of a liberal orientation in degrowth, where there's a kind of a politeness or politesse. There's certain things we want to say and certain things you can't say. And often we're avoiding conflict. Whereas for me, partly because I'm, the political tradition that I would come from is a Republican one. And in Republicanism, contestation is as important as consensus. It's the way a conflict is inevitable. We can grow from conflict. Conflict can be positive. And I think there's a kind of a liberal aversion amongst sections of what we really are talking about here are the reactionary is probably too strong a word, but maybe those liberal professional managerial class folk that we're thinking of here. And again, I'm naming it here. Other people listening to this might get pissed off that I'm being critical of them, and in a way I am, because I'd like to see the provocation of the letter. What is the response? Because what I would say, and I experienced this personally as an elected politician for 7 years, where I was the only Green Party elected member of a council, I realized you can be quickly dismissed, and that you're in the face of power, not when you're met with opposition or criticism, but when you're met with silence. That would be the worst thing to happen to this letter, and what is absolute silence. Then I would be more convinced, what we're dealing with here now is the protection of privilege and a liberal kind of disavowal of engaging in, maybe it's a difficult conversation, but let's have it.
And for Vlad and Félix, what was the response from the professional class? Has it been silence?
I mean, I don't know if you had anything during the summer, Vlad. So far, there hasn't been much, to be fair. There hasn't been much response aside from the people who attended the conference, people we knew read the letter, the people who eventually signed it too. And we've had one invitation for a discussion, but it's more or less linked to the IDN anyway. So it remains in the same kind of circle. So far, no true reaction, no answer. I wasn't truly expecting one, to be fair, because we weren't addressing anyone in particular, and it's very open. And I don't think any of the things we said or any of the ways we said the things were deserving of like an official academic answer in the paper, for example, or a more basic one in a keynote speech. Because I mean, I felt like the keynote speeches at the conference were, especially Julia Steinberger's, very much on, okay, we need to get into this struggle together now, and we have to find ways. So it did echo that pretty nicely, even though no reference was made. Maybe there will be some now, because people are coming back to work from the holidays. So maybe we'll have more, but I don't expect any more. I don't know about you, Vlad.
From me, the only reactions I've had were the emails in the Rise Up mailing lists, Degrowth World, the Feminism and Degrowth list, and Municipal Degrowth. I haven't noticed any negative reactions, but I'm aware of the memberships in those lists, which goes beyond the reactions that I had. So there's hundreds of folks who I assume have read the emails, the letter that was announced, and have decided not to respond. Other than that, I've had no other reactions.
I did have some really good conversations with activists. And one thing that was raised, and I said I'd raise it here with you guys, because it's a really important point, is with the issue of supporting people through the Solidarity Fund to finance their participation in degrowth conferences. And they were saying that this in itself could sort of create more inequalities, because what we're doing is we're saying to Global South people, why don't you keep coming to the Global North? Why don't you come to our ones in Europe? And so my question is essentially, how could the Solidarity Fund or any other sort of grassroots-led initiative help support Global South events, be they conferences, talks, or even more informal gatherings, to receive much more visibility, but also to have autonomy, so not to be like taken over by any sort of Global North institution or anything?
I think that's a really important question, because a cynic could maybe criticize this idea of a solidarity fund as a kind of a paternalism, because, the reality is that most of the well-paid, tenured, academics or people involved in the degrowth movement are from the Global North. And so therefore it's going to be the white, male, pale and stale. That'll be your biggest cohort where you can get the money. That is not the motivation behind this, but you can imagine how somebody would cynically view it as that. And it's one of the upsides. There wasn't many upsides with COVID and so on. Is that one of the things that COVID did is that we mostly all went online, and that did lower the costs of both Global South scholars attending Global North events online, but equally to be able to facilitate. And of course, there needs to be investment in the requisite technology and so on. And so once you have a fund, it seems to me, let's get the fund, and then we say, okay, how are we going to disperse it? On the basis of priority, on the basis of need, and it does seem to me that this could be a small, tiny act of even climate reparations in terms of actively promoting activities and initiatives in the Global South. And to be determined by colleagues in the Global South is for them to say what it is they want to talk about. And then can we then help them, with any finance and other support. Now, again, don't get me wrong, colleagues, I do think that nothing beats a face-to-face meeting, but I do think there are certain types of meetings, such as this one, which is more focused and intense, that can be done quite successfully online. I think the larger the conferences get, the hybrid, I don't particularly like. I don't think you can do both and so on. That's my own particular issue. But I do think the issue is once we get a commitment of people wanting to create a solidarity fund, to be able to pay scholars who aren't as economically privileged or secure as others, then we can also see, well, how else then can we help others who are also, involved in this movement, particularly given how Eurocentric degrowth is. How do we bring this? What does it look like in other parts of the world? So get the money, and then we decide, right, how do we decide on the priorities and who receives it? And that, to me, there are a number of issues to be done there. But I think the proposal in the letter, I think, is to be very much to be welcomed, that we cannot depend upon the free labor of activists. And I'm presuming you three are like me. You've been in activist circles a long time. And I've just seen far too many burnt out activists, who then turn cynical and they turn away from the movement because they just feel that they've been exploited, and their goodwill and passion and so on has not been, recompensed. So so in other words, just to finish, and I know I'm talking an awful lot, but then I am Irish, so I'm maybe partly allowed, is that we need to see that, this is work. Activism is work, and therefore work deserves to be both valued, recognized, and paid for. And for me, I would see this as an act of self-care. This is us as a movement explicitly saying we are going to care for people who are going to put time and effort and so on into this, who don't have the security of, an academic tenured position. So it's an act of care for people in the movement.
I feel like there are two separate things here. The first one on actual support, and the other one on, okay, so how much money we get in, what do we do with the money? I don't remember whether it was in our email thread or in another, but Vlad, you mentioned something about the pool, like some kind of pool structure in which we could have administrators from. So you want to expand on this?
I was mentioning before transparency and sortition and a very democratic governance of such a fund. Needless to say, the majority world will have to be involved in the governance of the fund, and they will have to be our partners in the distribution and the setting of priorities. Of course, the Global North has the money, but we shouldn't have the entire voice. I keep talking about the doctrine of proportionality, which I see at the core of capitalism defining the system. So we have to do away with this proportionality between power and property. That's the only way in which egalitarianism can be built from the grassroots up. Once the fund has been established, it can grow into a network of funds. My vision for this is to maintain existing structures, so you can use these existing organizations that already do great work in climate justice, social justice movements, emancipations, keep their existing structures, but embed them into a network of funds. This network can use like a mutual exchange of finance between funds, the same percentage, but not in absolute terms, so it'll be different amounts flowing in the network. You can link big funds with smaller funds, and the 1% comes from unions. It's usually 1% is the union dues here in Canada. It's not a big amount from gross income, so it's not a big amount to contribute to a local fund. If we make one here around IDN or outside IDN, it can be built on the same principles, but then we can link it to a nonprofit, to a labor union, to grants, because I'm not sure if the Commission or the European Parliament can give grants to such funds, but we can tap into the personal income of people working for those funds just to bypass the bureaucracy. So there's various ways in which you can build network, but just wrap up: transparency, sortition, and full egalitarianism. One human, one voice.
So that would be related, like, on the structure. Regarding the extent, because I think that's like another thing, the extent to which we can generate funds and redistribute them through such a solidarity fund. Because I'm back to work today, so I had a little bit of time while answering emails. I tried to make a sort of simulation based on very, very optimistic hypothesis. So basically, let's say 100 people from academia and adjacent degrowth friendly circles were to contribute to the fund according to the percentage bracket distribution that Vlad designed. And this is the distribution of people along the income bracket in this scenario. And so I made 10 simulations, and on average, this is what we would get in a year across these 10 simulations. If we have those very generous people, because I mean, that's still higher, that's a way higher income distribution than the main population is. So I'm trying to take into account the middle upper class bias of degrowth and degrowth adjacent circles here. Yeah. So that's why the distribution is so different. And so that's a huge amount of money, but at the same time, it's not that much. It's not that much to do all of the things we wanted to do. If we were to hire people in France, for example, because because the IDN is supposed to be located in France administratively, so it made sense to compare it. This would be 9 people full time on 1,600 euros a month. So it's not that high of an income either. But it's still maintain like full-time activism, but it's only 9 people and we don't have much left at the end of the year. And that's supposing very optimistic conditions. It's 100 people. I don't know, in all honesty, I don't know how many people we should be expecting here. If it's half that, if it's double that, I have no clue. But that's just to try to get an idea of the order of magnitude we're talking about here.
Yeah, this is great, Felix. It inspires me to think that as soon as I get a full-time job again, if I have to, I can't wait to pitch in the 1% or 3% of my income towards the cause. But to expand on this, we can have 9 folks in Europe, but we can have maybe 30 folks in Kenya or Congo. For the same amount.
Yeah. Because one thing I forgot to mention, talking about very optimistic views here, is I also added your 100% of everything exceeding 100,000 per year thing.
Right.
So that's there are a few, like 5 people that are above that income bracket that contribute a lot to the pool.
Yeah. So I think that's important. And my thinking is, we all know about unequal exchange. Since most of the plunder happens in the global south, let's help people there to stop the plunder at the source. So if they can shut down cobalt or lithium extraction on site, maybe that's more helpful than us lobbying here in the north. So we can get 100 people in the Congo, full-time paid activists, trained, with all sorts of tactics, theory and practice. They might be more effective than us just talking or writing op-eds to counter the Atlas network or whatever we have here.
I think the main caveat I would have to that specific idea, I'm afraid that would be considered very illegal very soon in many countries.
I probably don't expect any less than that.
Sure.
But
at the same
so
time,
it depends on what they do.
What I'm trying to say, this is not like some kind of shady black box either. That we can escape to very specific, borderline legal
for
actions.
Sure.
And we cannot convince people to contribute to the fund with that kind of ideas.
No, for sure. But I don't mean blowing up pipelines. That's not the first thought I have in mind. Like paying people to blow up pipelines. That's probably way down the list, but there's other things that can be done within the confines of law. As I understand the construction of capitalism, we kind of reach those limits, and probably we won't have ecocide law in place soon enough. So we might have to help advance ecocide laws first, so we can operate within a legal framework to criminalize extraction or plunder. So it comes down to strategies. This may not be immediate on our agenda, so probably the fund should be established first and let the governance decide democratically and with transparency what are the priorities within the legal confines, or maybe build on the imagination of the immediate future.
That's where things like, actively promoting engaged research, so that you could make it a condition that the research you want to see people doing is with communities. It's based on maybe a Ferrerian, emancipatory outcome. So there are ways in which, by staying within the confines of the law, we can get types of scholarship and research done that are not just within, dusty journals and so on. And that's an issue, of course, to come after once the fund is established, the governance, as you say, Vlad. And I don't think that would be that difficult to decide.
Back to you, Emma, if you have other things.
Okay. I was going to hinge on one last question because I think we're coming up to an hour, unless there's something you wanted to put in first.
No, I'm good. Felix, do you have anything?
I was just thinking, but it's not directly related to the fund. So regarding the concerns you voiced as to why should we limiting ourselves to inviting scholars and activists from the global south to attend conferences in the global north, I 100% agree on that. And I know we're quite a lot agree on that. And so one of the things that are currently being discussed within the IDN and with the Degrowth Conference organizing team is, does the IDN, once it's mature enough, get the responsibility of organizing the conferences within the organization? And if that's the case, we are very keen on organizing different conferences and organizing conferences in the Global South. That's still a lot of prospective elements here, a lot of unknowns. Just to say that's not something that's out of mind and out of the discussions right now. Those concerns are something we are aware of and are trying to organize ways to circumvent.
No, that's great to hear. Yeah, and at the sort of start of this discussion, sort of we mentioned that, you know, the letter that you guys wrote isn't sort of the end point; it's a starting point. Although in some circles the response has been nothing, there have been some really sort of productive conversations that have come out elsewhere from this, that are critiquing it, that are agreeing it, which is exactly kind of the point of the letter. So really, to bring it back sort of to my last question here, and I suppose the success of the Solidarity Fund and democratizing sort of degrowth, or whatever you want to call it, really comes down to this central point of decoupling status and merit, you know, for greater recognition and visibility for people's efforts, not just to be given to, you know, professors, academics, policymakers, but activists, you know, the working class, Global South, and other underrepresented voices. But my question is, and, you know, it's 2024. Why are we still having this conversation? I don't know if you have a better answer than me, because this is the thing that's stumping me, because we know what needs to be done. So why aren't we doing it? And when I say we, I speak very generally, because I know sort of everyone here is doing what they can. But yeah, why is it still a question and not an action?
Can I attempt a quick answer, Emma? I think, in my opinion, it comes from the deep fetish in the North with personal agency. It has to do with meritocracy, with the individual freedoms, with self-determination. That translates into a policy behaviors, how the PMC is constructed and how it relates to other classes. This fetish with meritocracy, it trickles down, if I can say that, into everything they do, into policy conversations, in-group talk, behind the curtains conversations, boardroom talks. It's all driven by this philosophy. And there's very little interest to move away from that position, from that intellectual position. And of course, determinism itself as a theoretical approach is difficult to translate into an elevator pitch, because it comes loaded with philosophy, with books, with science, with free will conversations, nurture versus nature conversations. I don't think we can be prescriptive about that, but I think that the left can learn to overcome that obsession or maybe dependence on determinism and merit, and status is linked to that. And that will be a form of liberation. Once you get rid of that mindset, of course, you don't have to say, I fully agree with Sapolsky that there's no free will. But operationally, social agency, how you move in society, can allow for a form of inclusion that will help our cause. You don't have to be a full determinist to take that position. But if you have time and read determinism, you will realize that we don't have personal agency whatsoever. Like, there's no merit in any status, in any position. We all come through chains of causality and luck and circumstance to where we are in life. Some of us can get across the Mediterranean in a boat. Some of us don't have that luck, but it's all chance. I'm fully against merit from that perspective. Sure, we can talk science, how the brain functions and how behaviors emerge from that, but I think that's where it's coming from. But since we don't have time to undo that quickly, perhaps via policy we can get there. Thinking that maybe a societal conversation via citizen assemblies that aims at policy. Let's try limitarianism. Let's try talk maximum wealth, phasing out the stock market and housing as a human right. These will have behavioral consequences. They might uproot determinism from the middle out, if I can say that. Sorry, I took a bit longer than I expected. Maybe I'm Irish too, John.
Now, I'll maybe come in here. I mean, I think every good social movement has to go through the old industrial workers of the world slogan, you know, the wobblies: educate, agitate, organize. And it seems to me, as somebody, I've not been particularly involved in the degrowth movement, although I am a post-growth scholar and I would know a lot of the other people involved in writing degrowth material. It's a fetishization of a particular form of knowledge as well. You know, if you have a movement that valorizes scholarly academic work in peer-reviewed journals or in academic publishers, well, guess what? Everybody's going to be judged by whether or not you're able to speak this language, get your work published in these journals, and so on. And, you know, I would defend that there's a need for that type of specialist knowledge, but only with the quality mark that myself and Vlad and I think Emma were commenting on. A lot of the work that's today produced, it's not quite bullshit in that kind of David Graeber sense, but I do question the quality of so much academic material being produced in journals and so on. Well, why not say what we need is to educate and produce knowledge, only part of which is this very specialist academic type of knowledge, and that actually you can produce politically relevant analyses of the shitty state of the world, its underlying causes, and identify ameliorative and solutions without using academic jargon. You know, you already mentioned, Vlad, you know, you can talk about post-growth and degrowth without using those terms. Good green jobs, you know, healthy air, you know, good food for ourselves, healthcare. There are so many ways we can talk about the elements of a degrowth, post-growth economy without using that actual term that actually land with people. You know, if I go out to where I live here and start talking to people about degrowth, they look at you with two heads, or even post-growth, or even sustainable development. These terms are bullshit terms for most ordinary people. I mean, to talk about, and that's, for me, it's about what's the language you need to speak with for the purposes of generating a movement beyond the academic core. And maybe that's the tension that your letter is indicating, is that the degrowth movement maybe is at a stage now, well, it's going to have to break out of the cradle or the nursery in which it developed within the academy and all the conventions of that, and actually break out into society, into, you know, the trade union movement, into working class organizations, into popular culture, to speak a language that most ordinary people can at least resonate with. And so for me, it is about seeing that knowledge is not coextensive with what we produce in the academy. That is arrogant, it's so limiting, and it denies us so many creative possibilities of seeing that the knowledge we need to create to help us identify the fundamental causes, the consequences, and the solutions to what we're facing need education. We need definitely to organize ourselves as well, which is that's why I like the Solidarity Fund and some of the other ideas you've discussed, that it's about getting ourselves organized. And ultimately, and this is probably a separate podcast, you know, what is the point of the degrowth movement? Is it to produce ever more finely grained, academically credible critiques that the world's gone down the shitter? Is that the job of degrowth? You know, to provide ever more, you know, fine-grained analysis of, you know, that reality that we could be the first species to accurately document our own demise? Or is it actually yet to do that and to appeal to people's emotions, their sense of justice and sense of solidarity in defense of life and so on? And that's a different proposition. So we need to then move beyond, as I say, the nursery within which perhaps degrowth developed in the academy, to actually see it then developing into a broader social movement and making connections with other social movements, particularly in my case with the trade union movement, you know, one of the oldest and strongest working class organizations. And there have been some, you know, developments made there, but it is about moving beyond where it began in the academy.
I mean, if I may, as a French guy, I am very honored to be able to be a bit of a history nerd on the early history of degrowth, especially in France, and how it came about and all those things. And one thing that I find interesting, and that makes it so I have quite conflicting views on the role of academia in degrowth, is that early on, degrowth was not, I mean, the décroissance movement in France in the early 90s was not an academic movement at all. It was a very activist-based movement. At the time, the connection just wouldn't make it with most political parties or trade unions because of the head-first rebuttal of growth and the growth mythos. And the degrowth had to be legitimized, had to be internalized in academia and legitimized there for it to become, once again, 15, 20 years later, a topic of discussion and something we need to reintegrate back into the mainstream. But that has been a long, drawn-out process, which has caused many sorts of crises in the degrowth world over the years. That's not the first time this discussion happens at all. And so, I mean, I'm not trying to say degrowth needs to remain in academia, not at all. I don't believe that. I think what I'm trying to say is that the rebirth, in a way, of degrowth in academic circles needs to be recognized as like the kind of polish and the kind of institutional legitimacy we can now bring onto the table. And I think that's like the kind of way we can also embark more academics in this kind of process, reminding that degrowth was not born in academia, and academia played a major part in maturing it as an idea and as a project. But now the role of academics is to force themselves to make that step back towards more activist roots. And I don't know how to turn it better than that, but that would be my final thoughts on the subject.
No, I agree with you, and I would argue it needs to, because I think no message from any academic, no matter what it is going to resonate with the working class. It's just not. We know that working class people just don't resonate or really actually trust a lot of these professional figures. Distrust is going up across countries sort of year on year. And what people need to see is sort of people like them or people just talking normal language. Hopefully, we're on the right track. So what we'll do is we'll leave this sort of discussion here for now. We know that it's sort of going to continue. I know you guys have got some sort of more stuff sort of planned in the pipeline. And hopefully you enjoyed it.